operate in strictest secrecy at the cutting edge of Australia's defence. They're creative, unorthodox, and comfortable in chaos. For over 50 years, the Australian SAS has put their lives at risk, deep behind enemy lines. This is the only television history ever supported by this highly secretive regiment. We take you beyond the stereotypes to reveal the unexpected story of the real people who transformed SAS from the ugly duckling of the Australian Army into pride of place as Australia's force of choice. On September 11, 2001, without warning, the World Trade Center in New York was attacked and destroyed, killing thousands of people. A new high-technology paradigm of asymmetric warfare had begun.
The best example of asymmetric warfare that I can think of probably in history was the flying of several aircraft into buildings in New York City. Was a way of hurting the United States in a manner that you just could not have dreamed about doing in a traditional military sense. Asymmetric attack means the application of force at a very precise place where it creates a great deal of harm but doesn't require a great deal of effort. It's a bit like the hydraulic effect, if you like. You get a small amount of pressure in one place will bring significant results elsewhere.
The Vietnam War was asymmetric war, the war of the flea. America's mighty military-industrial complex was defeated by asymmetric strategy. Hanoi avoided large conventional battles of attrition while attacking America's psychological, cultural and ideological aspirations through diplomacy and the media in history's first televised war. Stunned by the sudden devastation of their mythic heartland, Americans recall Japan's surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet in Hawaii in 1941 that forced America into World War II. That night, President Bush wrote in his diary, "The Pearl Harbor of the 21st century took place today. We think it's Osama bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda terrorists."
Al-Qaeda is guided by a philosophy largely written by Osama bin Laden, and in that philosophy it basically says that Muslims have not been shown respect, and the way to lash out against this is to attack America, which has earned them our attention.
Americans wanted bin Laden hunted down, and quickly. Bush said, "We are at war, and we will stay at war until this is done. Nothing else matters. Any money you need, you have it. I don't care what the international lawyers say. We are going to kick some ass." The FBI offered a $25 million reward for the capture of bin Laden.
In terms of the modern development of special forces, without question the single most important event was 9/11. Within several days of 9/11, the government took the decision to create a second tactical assault group, in other words, doubling the size of the specific force that was designed to meet the terrorist threat in the country. We doubled the size of the Special Operations Command, and we went from about 1,100 to more than double that number in the space of the next 2 years.
The Australian SAS had long expected terrorists to shift to asymmetric warfare and had trained assiduously for it.
The next day at work was clearly a game changer for everyone. Everyone knew that life wasn't going to be the same again after that, and that one way or another we were all to be involved. It was just a matter of where and how soon.
Then the very next morning I went to work as the operations officer, and I started to do what we call a concept of operations for SAS involvement in an operation. The only thing I left blank was the target country, because we didn't know.
There were liaison officers being deployed immediately to the United States to work out how we could help.
Bush called for an immediate ground invasion of Afghanistan.
The head of the snake, the Al-Qaeda senior leadership, is in the border area between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Militarily, the most difficult terrain I've operated in 40 years.
But although they commanded the most powerful arsenal in history, his defence chiefs told him it would take 6 months to mount an invasion of Afghanistan. The generals had no ready answer to the new asymmetric paradigm. The CIA knew that bin Laden was hiding with Al-Qaeda extremists somewhere in Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Bush spoke bluntly. Tell the Afghans to round up Al-Qaeda. Don't deal with bin Laden. I don't want to put $1 million missile on a $5 tent. Navy and Air Force aircraft and cruise missiles were dispatched quickly to bomb possible Al-Qaeda and Taliban targets. But without identified targets, US Air Force planes had to loiter, flying missions with nothing and no one to bomb. The only result of this bomb and hope strategy was more Taliban recruits. US intelligence reported about 100 Taliban guerrillas a day crossing into Afghanistan from Pakistan.
The CIA had seen the gathering momentum of Al-Qaeda in this area, so we were in a position where the CIA was already attuned, if not fully up to speed on the threat coming out of there, but they had linkage to the Northern Alliance.
These good CIA contacts were with the powerful Afghan warlords and troops of the anti-Taliban Northern Alliance. The CIA offered Bush a quick victory over the Taliban. Bush agreed at once. The CIA brought together special forces, covert action, intelligence gathering, sophisticated technology, agency paramilitary teams, and cash incentives for the anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan. The CIA told its station chief in Kabul, "Get bin Laden. I want his head in a box. I want to take it and show the president." Using captured Russian helicopters, the CIA inserted US Green Berets special forces covertly into northern Afghanistan. With the eyes and ears of the Northern Alliance warlords, high-tech satellite phones, and eye-in-the-sky Predator drone aircraft, the Green Berets soon pinpointed the Taliban for US Navy and Air Force strikes. Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, fighting a conventional war, were defeated in 6 weeks. But the defence chiefs, uneasy about using special forces and the CIA, credited the victory to conventional air power.
As far as US Special Forces were concerned, we were very much aware of the work they had done. They'd gone in to light up targets for the Air Force to bomb. They'd also worked very close with the Northern Coalition, or the Northern Forces, fighting against the Taliban.
Osama bin Laden was still at large, threatening more attacks via the internet and Al Jazeera satellite television. As the US Army prepared to invade Afghanistan with conventional forces, the CIA warned that the Taliban had rallied, switching from conventional to guerrilla warfare. Yet America was moving in the opposite direction, from asymmetric to big army, conventional attrition warfare. The Taliban were jubilant. Larger forces make larger targets, with a major propaganda bonus. President Bush called for allies to join the invasion of Afghanistan for what he called the global war on terror.
John Howard was in the States at the time of 9/11, and he threw his support behind George W. Bush.
Australia's commitment included a 100-man SAS squadron as the lead element.
So by early October in 2001, the Australian government had made it very clear that its strategic intent was to join with the US and other nations in the global war on terrorism. The challenge for the SAS was to find a suitable tactical role to achieve that strategic intent.
As soon as my squadron got told it looks likely we're going to go to Afghanistan, we're all ecstatic, as you could imagine. A whole group of warfighters getting to go to war again after just coming back, short break and away we go. It was like we'd won the lottery, basically.
At that time, we'd only really just returned from operations in East Timor and Solomon Islands and so on, so all our kit had to be sort of converted for desert operations. All our camouflage paint had to be modified.
We decided, as a patrol really, that we would do a lot of walking with packs, a lot of fitness type training, because we knew one way or another we were going to be walking up mountains with a lot of weight, and luckily we did that because that's what ended up happening.
We carried everything with us. Our packs were up to 85 kilos, and that was a constant, climbing mountains with that.
I was going to be probably on the back of the vehicle because I'm a medic and I have heavy weapon experience using the machine guns. So straight away I wanted to know which car I was going to be using, and they said, oh, the cars are already being moved in a country. So we'll meet up with them in the future. What weapons do we have on the cars? Where are we doing our build-up? What medications do we need? And one of the biggest ones in our heads was landmines. Is there any extra armour going to be added to the bottom of the cars? What's the weight of that extra equipment? Things like that.
We had a lot of briefs on, Soviet military hardware, because we knew there was a lot of that in country, and we knew that the people we would be going against would probably be using that type of thing. So how to identify certain types of armour, weaponry and that type of thing.
I guess we were being prepared for everything. We were taking a whole wide range of kit. The only thing we weren't really taking was water operations gear, much to the chagrin of the water operators. A lot of freefall equipment. We'd seen the American Rangers jump into Afghanistan, and American Special Forces there was famous sort of footage of them riding on horseback along with bands of crazy Afghan tribesmen. We certainly saw ourselves doing any of those sort of roles.
On the 7th of October 2001, 3 weeks after 9/11, the US, Great Britain and France invaded Afghanistan in Operation Enduring Freedom. However, when they arrived in the Middle East, they found the British and US Special Forces had taken all the strategic jobs.
And that meant that, like we'd done in Australia many times before, I needed to travel. I found myself with a very small element, deploying to the Middle East, speaking to senior US and coalition commanders, explaining to them just what the Australian SAS would bring to the operation.
We first went to Oman, seek support from the Sultan of Oman for us to lodge in there and work with the US Tier 1 organisation, the Special Forces unit that was there, and the British SAS, which are also within our grouping. The Sultan had felt he'd done enough, and so we then moved to Kuwait. And from Kuwait we tried to find a job that was suitable for our capability. But you probably need to remember, I suppose, is that SAS hadn't done a significant operation since Vietnam, and the corporate memory for the US military doesn't extend back to Vietnam. The response by the Americans had already started. The Northern Alliance with the US Special Forces group was coming down from the north, and we thought this thing would be over. Now you have to appreciate our writing instructions were very clear. That is to make a meaningful contribution to the response under ANZUS. It was about how we were perceived by the US. It was very much that entrepreneurial approach to find a task.
We were very much like a gypsy army. We would go and attach ourselves to any unit that had work for us.
One of the senior US commanders that I spoke to was a US Marine Brigadier, Brigadier General Mattis, Jim Mattis, and he knew something of Australia through his reading of the story of Breaker Morant. And he was very keen to listen to what we might bring to the table.
Gus came in with his lads. Immediately obvious were a couple of things. Number one, we had a real pro in command. Unflappable, down to earth, and quietly eager to get into the brawl.
He eventually found a role for the SAS task group as part of his command in southern Afghanistan.
My fleet commander, Vice Admiral Willie Moore, recognizing the enemy would reinforce Kandahar, wanted me to land in southern Afghanistan move against Kandahar's lines of communications and isolate Kandahar and, quote, raise hell, unquote, with the Taliban.
Mattis launched the longest helicopter raid in history from the northern Arabian Sea into southern Afghanistan.
About 4 days prior, the Navy SEALs had gone in by covert means and were watching the landing zone for us so we'd know there's no enemy there. And of course, the first special forces that joined Captain Harwood's SEALs and my Marines were the Australian SAS, and they were codenamed Task Force 64 for that operation. Went in basically with about 150 assault troops in the first helicopters, air refuelable, 150 in the second group, and the KC-130s brought in pre-deployed Marines off the ships from Pakistan once the helicopters had seized the dirt strip in the southern Afghanistan desert.
Flew in by night on a desert airstrip. We flew over the top of the airfield and conducted this sort of crazy corkscrew manoeuvre where we just descended rapidly and then landed under NVGs. Middle of nowhere, everything was in blackout, and we could see the American Marine positions as their sort of foxholes, I guess, spread out in a perimeter. Some elements of the squadron arrived the night before, and they were already in battle procedure, so vehicles were being fitted with ammunition and food and water and so on.
Forward Operating Base Rhino, a former opium factory, gave the US-led coalition its first strategic foothold in Afghanistan. Al-Qaeda reacted immediately.
Locals had been observing the area and they'd fired mortars and so on.
There was constant probing of the actual perimeter. We had a layered defence. So we'd get probed quite a bit, you know, toing and froing of fire, whether it be from our side or theirs, and a few mortars.
When we arrived in southern Afghanistan, it was pretty much a blank canvas. I knew that General Mattis wanted us to physically and psychologically dislocate the Taliban in the south, and to do that we needed to get our patrols out as quickly as possible and also to cover a vast area in the south to catch the Taliban by surprise.
I explained to Gus that it's very simple. I don't want the enemy to ever fall asleep without feeling like the door could be kicked in and they're going to die. I don't want them to find any refuge anywhere. They're to be hunted down and keep the pressure on them. Obviously, we were greatly outnumbered down there then, and it would take an aggressive stance to make certain that our own small outpost there did not become threatened. He understood that immediately. They went into the fight sometime within 48 hours, 72 hours. His troops came in with very good kit. They had a tremendous vehicle. I believe it was about a six-wheeled Land Rover type vehicle that was wonderfully adapted for the Afghan terrain we were in. From their weapons to their optics to their communications gear, we found them first rate. But more importantly, they had an attitude that we look for among fighting men. And all you really look at when you're going into a fight is one thing: will he stand and fight beside me?
General Mattis gave one squadron the wide tactical discretion that is the oxygen of SAS operations.
That meant that patrols were going out to the north, to the east and to the west, almost within days of arrival, to dominate the area of operations. The net effect of that was that before too long, flags started appearing in the operations rooms, not only in the Middle East AO, but also back in CENTCOM, in Central Command in the United States, and in other coalition areas, indicating that Australia was conducting effective operations throughout the south of Afghanistan. And that in many ways was the launch pad for subsequent successful operations by the SAS in Afghanistan throughout 2001-2002.
Modern military theory is heavily based on manoeuvre theory, and one of the main objects of that is to create such a high rate of tempo of operations and to target the enemy commander's mind so that you actually cause him to freeze like the rabbit in lights. And SAS obviously are a great contributor to that. Generally, manoeuvre theory requires smaller forces with higher impact. Special forces, SAS, have that ability to be employed in small forces, in small numbers, to be projected at great speed over quite some distance, and to operate with a disproportionate effect. So they fall in ideally into manoeuvre theory and therefore modern military theory.
Good to go.
All of our patrols remained out there for at least 2 to 3 times the length that anyone else was staying out. They were only staying out for a few days, and we were out there for at least in the vicinity of 2 weeks plus.
The wind chill that we had, remember we were in open vehicles at the time and quite exposed to the elements, was one guy measured and it was down to minus 45 degrees.
One patrol stayed out for 52 days, which is they were certainly looking forward to a shower and a good hot meal. The American 4-star General was very impressed with our reporting, the volume of information, predictions and things like that. He was also very impressed with the length of time that we could remain out in the field unaided. He said, "I can't believe you guys, you're out there like balls on a bulldog."
Now the cars are turbocharged, some not turbocharged, so at higher altitudes they don't work so well. Now, keeping the cars operating in these freezing conditions was a bit different. At night time we'd light little fires under the petrol tanks. Being diesel wasn't a problem because diesel at freezing temperatures turns to a gel and it's hard, it doesn't burn, doesn't go through the fuel line.
Just get a big rock coming down that hill, a bit of sump oil coming out of one of the front cars.
So all the jerry cans and all the water bottles would freeze at night. So you had to sleep with a couple of water bottles, stop them from freezing so you'd have water to drink the next day. We don't drink tea or coffee, we don't wash if we don't have to, the water is just for drinking. The American soldiers used to call them the Chevs, like Chevy cars, they drink a lot of fuel. The American soldiers, they drink a lot of water. Halfway through a patrol, most of Australian soldiers would have still a lot of water left when the Americans are getting low. They're not used to operating for 2 to 3 weeks on the field without resupply. Once they got around to the idea that they have to live unaided, as a patrol, they come good pretty much straight away. But it's difficult for them to adjust initially.
Our reputation in Afghanistan grew very quickly to the point where we were sent to a southern Afghani province to deal with some rocketeers who were rocketing an American Special Forces safe house. They were getting rocketed every day and every night, indiscriminately, and the rockets were set up on timing devices so they were very hard to catch. By the time we got down there, they were still getting rocketed up to 4 hours to our arrival. And for the 10 days that we were there, not a rocket was fired. 6 hours after we left, there was an ambush and more rockets fired. So our reputation down there hopefully saved some lives.
In asymmetric warfare, success is not regime change or capturing territory and assets, but the endorsement of the people. All special forces therefore practice hearts and minds operations.
Oftentimes your target is not the enemy. All you do with the enemy is keep them away from the innocent people. Your target is the hearts and minds of the innocent people. And you don't have to make them love you. You just have to gain their support. And the Australians have proven capable of this with both special forces and general purpose forces.
We had to sort of work out who's who in the zoo and what their centre of gravity was in relation to where they were placed in the whole strategic situation of Taliban versus the Mujahideen. Whenever we go on operations, you have to establish rapport and trust very quickly with them, and Hearts and Minds is a great way to do that. You establish a system of trust and it grows very quickly, although you have to follow that up with a real commitment to helping them. You can't go in there with ulterior motives. They'll pick it up straight away.
Yeah, the locals seem to be happy to see us.
And that's where I think we do well, is because we generally care about, the types of injuries, the elderly, whenever we give them medical treatment and things like that. It's not hard for us to establish trust straight away.
The SAS teams, however, were realistic about conducting hearts and minds operations. in the tough, war-hardened communities.
To get to know the local Afghans, probably for the whole Middle East, it can prove difficult to get to really know them. We have differences in culture, economic backgrounds, language, and the biggest one, I guess, is always going to be religion. The soldiers themselves, the same as Timor, I always found the locals willing to smile, to say hello, a bit different to home where it's sometimes hard to elicit a smile out of someone you don't know. The people would always take us in under the old Pashtun code of looking after the traveller, take us in, feed us. However, you could never mix with the women. You might talk to the smaller children. So that was always a segregation. That wasn't because we were Westerners, it's simply their way. The only people who are going to see the women are very close relatives and very close friends.
Afghanistan was biblical. A completely austere environment. For Westerners used to many luxuries, it was quite a culture shock to go into a lot of these compounds and realise how little people were doing with. They literally had a mud hut compound. A couple of rugs, cooking utensils, a small amount of personal belongings that they kept in trunks, and even as individuals they certainly weren't equipped to deal with the harshness of winter that we were. I mean, quite regularly we're astounded by small children, young children, wearing a pair of shoes, no socks and a couple of layers of clothes. Whilst we were standing wearing the best that modern technology could give us in terms of Gore-Tex rainwear and socks, thermals, insulated clothing, it was quite amazing how little they could actually get by with.
In general, the Afghani people are beautiful people. They are just like us. They love their family, they want to be able to provide better for their family. And their values lie in water and food quite strongly because of their situation. With Taliban or any sort of standover techniques being used by other villages and warlords and things like that, they obviously respond the same as we do. They don't like it. They'd rather just be left in peace to live and grow.
And you'd go from one town to the other, and the people you'd just seen in this town 50 kilometres away, they would be in the next town greeting you, and you'd say to yourself, how do these guys do it? Because there's not too many ways they can get around you.
We'd been given some apples from another village, and we didn't eat those. We gave them to the villagers that needed the food, and the amazing thing that I remember was the children were picking the seeds out of the apples to grow the apples. And that was a really, that sort of hit everyone to see that, these kids running off with the seeds to the parents and not really paying much attention to eating the apples.
We did a lot of interrogation of the villagers that were there, so we'd go and do village assessments. We'd set up medical clinics, which is another way for us to get information off them. And we basically just established a presence in the Paktia province, which denied Al-Qaeda or the Taliban having a presence there. So we were continuously driving around, living in that area, and they never knew when we were going to turn up or what we were doing. And basically we denied them that area. We actually stayed in their houses. We shared their food with them. They'd go out and kill a goat, they'd cook it up for us.
We'll be out in some lake, see if we see a bit of ice.
We're just staying back a bit because fishing Afghan style.
Well, you'll be going hungry again.
She's off. There you go. And there we go. Give that a bit of a flick. There they are.
When you're living there and when they invite you in, they're quite hospitable. You know, but as soon as you drive away 5 minutes later, you know, they'll be, you know, back at shooting you.
SAS patrols always looked for a safe harbour at night.
Now, hiding from the locals is very, very difficult. You know, the cars make a lot of noise. No matter what you do, they make noise because of the ammunition and the guns and just the signature they leave on the ground. One time in particular, we thought that we were very sneaky this night. We moved quite a few times, ended up in this creek line which was almost impossible to get into. You know, we have escape routes, of course, and one of the guys who was up on an OP, away from the vehicles, looking across a flat, he said, you know, we're going to have a bit of trouble here. We've got a lot of people heading towards our way. And there must have been 200 locals heading our way, an extended line. You know, you could see they weren't armed, but they were sort of cheering and they had bowls of food in their hands, and, you know, I thought, what the hell's going on here? You know, how could they possibly find us? He said, you cannot hide from us. We know this area very well. Our goats normally come here. Our goats don't want to go there, we find out why.
Once we'd been to a few villages and that, we sort of worked out a bit of a plan on how we'd approach them and how we were being received. We'd have small packets of chocolates and lollies and things like that that we would give to the kids, and as we drive along the kids would run behind you and all that sort of thing, and we'd chuck them bags of lollies, and in one village the kids run. They thought it was a hand grenade because that's what happened quite a few years ago. So that was a bit of a faux pas on our point, which we deconflicted very quickly. So one of the guys jumped off the back of a truck straight away and went up to the lollies and started eating them and offered them out to the children. Rather than wait to deconflict with the elders, he got off and deconflicted that straight away.
As far as trying to distinguish between them, who were the Taliban, who were the locals, and who were the Al-Qaeda, almost impossible. They dress the same, they eat the same, they walk the same, and all the men carry guns as well. They all have AKs or a similar sort of Russian-style weapon from the Russian era.
When he turns 8, a Pashtun boy is given an AK-47.
There one incident, it was the last vehicle coming out of a village, and it was a father and son leaning up against the wall with a rifle. The young lad grabbed the rifle and went to bear the rifle in our direction, so I quickly made it look like I was going to commit myself to shooting in their direction. This caused the father to react very quickly to take the rifle from the child. He then was very aggressive towards me. I then became a little bit more aggressive, shouting at him, and he put his weapon down, and they were quite abusive towards us as we left. But you've got to deal with those sorts of things very quickly so as to prevent a loss of life.
Afghanistan is a very demanding environment, so very much in families you can see that one of the sons will be working for the government, one of the sons will be working for the Taliban, and one of the sons will just be running his own drugs. So you can be a warlord one day, Al-Qaeda handler the next, and drug runner on the third day. And there's nothing duplicitous in it apart from the fact that they're just doing whatever it takes to make a living for their family.
B Troop were tasked from intelligence of finding this ammunition cache in this small town in Afghanistan. There was a lot of mines in our area of operations, or our AO, PE2 mines, POM-Zs, which were defence mines. Also, there's a few of the old Russian, what we call butterfly mines. There was a lot of anti-tank mines, and you would see actual mine markers that the locals would put up. And then you'll see another mine marker which would contradict the first marker that you saw. So it was really running the gauntlet. You didn't know which was which sometimes, and you just had to take potluck.
In one of the areas we were in, there was a feature, and we just called it Alpha Quebec 037, so Al-Qaeda, hopefully the 37th hill we've checked out. And we sort of looked at it, and there's this huge muzzle facing out our direction from this big feature, and we've gone, what the hell is that? The villagers came out to see us, and they go, oh, it's the the old village protection tank we have. So when the Russians pulled out, they'd left what was there, and it's still got ammunition. It looks as if it'll still work. And then they said, well, have a look at the bunkers. And so we got the whole village basically going in ahead of us because there was a big issue with landmines in Afghanistan. There's Russian anti-tank mines, there's RPG rockets, there's shells for artillery pieces. There was lots of stuff.
On the actual site there was several BRDMs, artillery pieces, T-72s, T-64 and also T-54, which are armoured tanks.
No Taliban here.
So we stayed there overnight.
Doing a strongman trick.
The next day, I sent in an American EOD, like explosives demolitions team.
Karzai had issued an edict at the time that all of the ammunition and mines and stuff that was found was to be destroyed, primarily to take it out of the system from the insurgents. But this was going to have a grave impact on the local villagers who often used mines that they recovered from elsewhere to protect their own crops. So we started facing a bit of resistance from the tribal elders when it became clear to them that we were actually going to blow up all of the 16 tonnes.
You set up the blow.
We rigged up this tank. We used American det cord, Australian detonators, Pakistani explosives that we'd taken out of their armoured anti-personnel mines, initiator charges basically out of the Russian equipment. So we had this hodgepodge of equipment that was all explosives and was all serviceable.
Just prior to this, unfortunately one of our mates stepped on a PE2 as they're called, or toe popper, anti-personnel mine.
Lacerated fingers and some of the blast had gone up into his face, but he'd lost a couple of toes and it was pretty bad damage. And we've gone, right, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the worst, what pain are you in? He goes, 9. We've gone, holy crap, what constitutes a 10 for this man? So after that, the pain scale for anyone in SAS, we can only go to 9 now, because if he goes 9, none of us are going to say 10. Got emergency care done, got him extracted within an hour, so it was really quite quick.
And luckily there was no sympathetic detonation from this mine to all the other ammunition.
Yeah. Brickator's pulling some of the shells out.
After that, we blew up the tank, the armoured personnel carrier and the 2 bunkers. So we've gone, oh yeah, this will be all right. We've moved away from the position, gone, yep, made sure none of the locals were going to go back up and try and collect souvenirs or something, because we're blowing away their protection.
This is going to be a bloody event.
We thought we were a safe distance away, let's say 2 kilometres away from this target.
There she goes.
When this thing went off, it was massive.
And you can just see the turret doing little loops. And then the big one happened.
Yeah, keep driving, brother.
And it could be seen apparently 20 kilometres away, but apparently it also measured on the Richter scale as some sort of really large earth movement.
And it was picked up by the American satellites overhead, so it was quite an impressive explosion, more impressive by the fact that we were probably only about 400 metres from it, which seemed the right place to be before we stopped, but certainly as we had large chunks of shrapnel whistling overhead and we all dived under our vehicles giggling like schoolgirls, it probably wasn't the best decision at the time.
After those initial patrols around Camp Rhino or Fob Rhino, it was clear that there was no one within that area that was really sympathetic to the Taliban. If they were, then they clearly weren't Taliban fighters. So I think the decision after we came back to Rhino was the whole squadron picked up holus bolus, all our vehicles, loaded all our stores into a convoy essentially, and we made our way through the desert to Kandahar.
They operated in a recon surveillance role in support of the Marines as they moved towards Kandahar airfield.
We literally arrived at Kandahar and the place was still smoking. The front gate, was still a smoking grill, and apparently the C-130 had fired on that and knocked out a tank and a few other Taliban positions.
Once they were in Kandahar, they operated all around Afghanistan, as far north as where we would later conduct Operation Anaconda. They were there in January, very cold time of the year.
Doing a bit of snow driving. Just been recalled to Kandahar ASAP. So, as usual, no one has a freaking clue what's going on. Tell them the height, mate. We're at a high of 9,600 feet today.
My patrol did do reconnaissance and missions for Marine direct action tasks while we were down there. So we would sort of go in first, land in a helicopter, ride quad motorbikes 20 kilometres to a position. Hide the bikes, recon a target for a couple of days, and then the Marines would come in and clear it. You always go out with preconceived ideas of what's there. You have a lot of satellite imagery, a lot of intelligence reports on certain areas, but until you actually get there on the ground, you basically go there and you confirm what's there. So that's the best way to conduct business, having human beings on the ground reporting back what they see.
The operation at that stage against the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda insurgents was in fact more characterised as a guerrilla warfare campaign, so we're deploying small groups and then up to troop and squadron size.
Part of Mattis's strategy was to recruit local warlords to work for the coalition forces.
The people who had gone against the Taliban and with the Americans were self-styled generals, so and under the pay of the Americans. So what was a general and what was a warlord? It was probably at times difficult to ascertain. If they're on our side, they're an officer. If they're an enemy, they're a warlord. The warlords generally were in for whatever they could get out of the situation. So if they could get payment for whatever, whether it was supplying men to build things, whether it was supplying vehicles, whether it was supplying bodyguards, whether it was supplying soldiers, they were quite willing to do so for money.
In December 2001, the relentless CIA located Osama bin Laden in the Tora Bora caves in the White Mountains in eastern Afghanistan. Searching cave by cave was extremely dangerous. US and British Special Forces and Allied Afghan troops, guided by the CIA, attacked the Tora Bora, calling in airstrikes on suspected bin Laden bunkers. But Al-Qaeda suddenly called a truce. The Americans wanted to fight on, but their Afghan allies pointed their rifles at them, allowing bin Laden and many Al-Qaeda to escape into Pakistan via the rat lines of the porous, problematic border.
One of the enduring problems with the Afghan-Pakistan border is that it's a notional border at best. Certainly the tribal allegiances there are strong, and it's the same tribe on both sides of the border. To them, there is no national boundaries. They're an artificial thing brought in after the division of Pakistan, India and Afghanistan, and to them it's just an arbitrary border they ignore. Therefore, because of that, they have well-established trade routes and migration routes which they use, which they can also use as escape and evasion lines or smuggling lines to move ammunition and people in and out of Afghanistan. Due to the nature and the terrain of the border area, these are very hard to put permanent surveillance on. Certainly in the winter, with a high snow coverage, it's a harsh environment, and because the locals know all the nuances of the trade routes, unless you know intimately where the routes are going, it's very hard to target the right area.
Ironically, with the arrival of the coalition, the huge Afghan opium industry supplying much of Europe and Britain actually began to grow.
Drug plantations, as we know or knew even before we went in, was a big part of the economy of the country. The fact is that the Taliban were trying to cut back on the plantations. Once we went in, it was free for all again, in that the warlords that were governing the various provinces and areas, their income had been coming and was coming again from the sale of opium, and to a lesser extent from the sale of marijuana. And everything was okay so long as we didn't broach talking about the very large plantations of opium poppies and the very large stands of marijuana. The whole livelihood of an area was dependent on it. So farmers, looking after wives, children, very small amount of money, even from the sale of opium. If that was taken away, then it would be strife for everyone. As well as losing the local population, you would also be losing the backup of the local warlords.
The Taliban were mountain fighters, so SAS patrols, often on the lower ground, had to be very watchful.
We needed to put a foot patrol out to identify if there were any Taliban, Al-Qaeda in the area. But after we dropped this patrol off, we went back to the forward air base down in Kaus, which is about, at patrolling pace, about 4-hour drive. By the time we got back there, we had reports that this patrol had been contacted. So the squadron commander came up and he said, "Listen, Mofty, you've been there before. We need you to lead the squadron in as quick as we can get there." And we've got 12 vehicles going flat out, armed to the teeth, ready to rescue one of our patrols. They were in a hell of a mess. They've been in contact for about 5 hours at this stage. So they were running low on ammunition, so they were in dire straits. And as we approached the creek line, all hell broke loose. I was at the front and I remember looking around and hearing this contact and seeing it. And the amount of gunfire and tracer coming into and out of that valley was a sight that I'll never forget. It was the best fireworks display I've ever seen in my life. And I remember saying to my driver, "I don't know how many people are going to be dead in this, but it's not going to be good." We broke through the contact, so we drive through any ambush site. Nobody was hurt. As it worked out, they were on the bones of their ass pretty much. They had nothing except their weapon, their webbing, and pretty much all had empty magazines. We had American planes come in and support us. I'm sure they took a whole foot off the top of this mountain range where the fire was coming out of. And just as we were about to start moving out, I remember looking down the valley and I saw this white flash and I thought, that looks like a rocket coming in. And as quick as I thought that, this rocket comes straight over the top of our cars and we're back into it again. Now it exploded 20 feet behind us. So the gunships come in and the C-130 come in again, and it took probably another foot off the top of this mountain. It just destroyed it. I don't know how there were still people running around there firing back at us. It must have been hundreds of them up there. Anyway, so we moved out, and this is where we had what we called close support, danger close. We were getting fragged from the rounds from the C-130 coming close to us, coming onto the cars. Also there were rocks exploding around us from the 14.5 from the enemy position, exploding around us like grenades, and guys were getting hit. And it was very, very close, and once again, not a single hit on the Australian soldiers. But the next day, my patrol was sent up to the top of this mountain on foot to assess the damage. And the sight above when we got there was amazing. There was, as I said, I reckon a foot of this mountain, about as big as the MCG. It was just levelled. And we found machine guns with tripods on them, twisted and buckled, bent at 90 degrees. A hell of a lot of blood everywhere. Donkeys that had been shot up. Old positions that had just been absolutely annihilated. I don't know how many people had died that night. Anyone's guess is what it was. We were lucky to have the Americans there supporting us.
Unfortunately, the culmination of my term there, my initial term there, was the death of Andy Russell, whose vehicle, his patrol was, he was commanding at the time, drove over an unexploded device.
We scrambled as fast as we could. Bob Harwood launched C-130s and parachute jumpers jumped in, medical personnel jumped in, but we weren't able to save him.
Andy Russell's death was a very significant event in the squadron. It was the first death that we'd had in the regiment for a long time, and certainly the first battle death we'd had in a long time.
I mean, it's not something you take willingly, but you accept as part of the terrain of being in SAS.
In late December 2001, Gus Gilmore had to return to Australia. He was replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Rowan Tink. At this time, the squadron was meant to withdraw to Kuwait to re-examine its best role against proliferating Al-Qaeda groups.
There was a potential for Al-Qaeda to emerge and create issues in Yemen, in Somalia, and in Sudan. And we didn't know at that particular stage whether there were going to be special forces deployed into those areas. They were options.
Should the small SAS squadron be switched to African states to tackle Al-Qaeda? But a new build-up of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, detected near the Pakistan border, demanded priority. And despite the appalling winter, the coalition's hunt for Osama bin Laden and the remaining Al-Qaeda terrorists continued without pause.
We were doing a lot of long-range reconnaissance and weeks out in the field in the middle of winter, which was something that no other coalition force was doing.
In January, one squadron's arduous patrolling finally paid off.
We were operating at squadron level north of Kandahar. The further north we went, the locals were a lot less willing to speak to us, seemed a lot more cautious, a lot more nervous, and did not necessarily want to be seen speaking to us. And that gave us the indication that the presence was, if not right there, in the vicinity.
The suspect vicinity was the Shahi Kot Valley.
I sent a troop over to that valley area purely on spec, on the basis of, probably one, maybe two EW indications. My interest was spiked when the reporting from that troop indicated a level of heavy weaponry, armoured vehicles, gun positions, dug-in positions, armed numbers of armed people walking around, and artillery pieces.
They also detected dense Taliban telephone traffic in the valley. Had they at last found Osama bin Laden? US intelligence struggled to reconcile the detailed SAS reports of the enemy's strength with their impression of a weakened Al-Qaeda.
I'm not sure that the coalition had quite the idea that there were those sorts of things in that valley. We'll pull off very quickly. It forced the troop to move by night, which in those temperatures I regarded as dangerous. It was, often overnight it was -16 to -18 without wind chill. So add movement in an open LRPV. Sometimes the guys are exposed to -30 odd degrees. That was crossing a line for me. It was clear that something was going to happen at some point for us to be pulled off.
The US decided immediately on Operation Anaconda, an invasion of the valley to annihilate bin Laden and Al-Qaeda.
Coalition had to act, otherwise the longer you wait, the more propensity an operation has to fail. You need to be proactive, and I don't think waiting any longer, maybe for summer, would have been successful. The Taliban and Osama bin Laden, or individuals could just get on a donkey with one or two other people and just make their way over a mountain pass to Pakistan to freedom.
You could say that there were two reasons for going in there. One was to bring Al-Qaeda and the resisting Taliban to battle, and the second was to capture Osama bin Laden. There were a number of villages in there, and it was a natural fortress area that the Taliban had used in the days when they were fighting the Russians back in the 1980s.
Undeterred by the two disastrous Russian defeats in the 80s, in early 2002, the Americans planned just such a conventional airborne assault on the Shahi Kot Valley Taliban stronghold. The multinational Special Forces groups, including the enthusiastic Australian SAS squadron, were invited to join the invasion. But the invasion plan caused serious concern among the Australians.
Australia was the only nation out of all the Special Forces fraternity that were there that would not sign up to the plan. We had an insight to the first draft for Anaconda, which was audacious. It just seemed to involve landing various Special Forces units across all the nations that were there into different landing zones simultaneously to attack known enemy strong points or known enemy concentrations. Australia wasn't happy with the level of intelligence or the information so far gleaned.
It was a little bit thin. It didn't really, so I don't think anyone really knew what was there. You know, a lot of satellite imagery, a lot of UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle flyovers, live footage of looking at what's there, but because the area was relatively large, it's very hard to pinpoint an exact position for a camera to look at. So you might miss something by a metre, but it doesn't mean there's something not a metre away.
All right, we're at 2700. And individuals moving with a wheelbarrow up to that same area.
There was no sort of human eyeball looking down in the valley and identifying where these positions might be. I remember at the time that the mood in the squadron was that we felt that we were missing out, that we're being maybe overcautious, maybe generals or politicians in Australia were being gun shy as to our commitment. And also, to add injury to insult, we're not allowed to have a beer that night. For Australians, it was no alcohol in Afghanistan. That was the policy.
To break the impasse with the SAS, the Americans came up with a shrewd suggestion.
Well, if you're not happy with the intelligence picture for Anaconda, why don't you go out there and do it for us?
The SAS squadron eagerly took up the challenge. Charlie Troop, 1 Squadron SAS, was dispatched to ground truth the Shahi Kot Valley for enemy strength. What Charlie Troop discovered in the Shahi Kot would soon thrust the SAS into the centre of the biggest and most deadly battle of the Afghanistan war so far, Operation Anaconda.